She had never once missed her ride home. Not once, not in 3 years of high school. Every single day, the same routine, the same sidewalk, the same car pulling up at the same time. Her family built that routine like a fortress around her, because they knew something the rest of the world often forgets, that some people need the world to be predictable to stay safe in it. So when 17-year-old Mary London didn't show up at her pickup spot on the afternoon of January 14, 1981, her family didn't tell themselves she'd probably gone to a friend's house. They didn't wait it out. They didn't assume a teenager was just being a teenager. They called the police that same night, because they understood something was terribly wrong the moment the routine broke. Less than 24 hours later, a stranger driving down a forgotten dirt road on the edge of Sacramento found her body lying on the shoulder, stabbed, left in the dirt like something discarded. And then nothing. No suspect, no weapon, no witness, just a name, a question mark, and a family that would spend the next 39 years waiting for an answer that modern science hadn't even been invented to give them yet. When that answer finally came, it wouldn't come from a confession. It wouldn't come from a break in the case, or a deathbed admission, or an eyewitness who finally found the courage to speak. It would come from something that, in 1981, didn't exist anywhere on Earth, a piece of technology so advanced it could reach across nearly 4 decades, into the DNA of people who never even knew they were part of this story, and pull a name out of the dark. But here's the part that makes this case different from almost every other cold case you've ever heard solved. When investigators finally learned who did this to Mary London, they discovered he had been dead for 38 of those 39 years. He had been a teenager too, and he had been murdered himself in a completely unrelated crime, just 1 year after he killed her, meaning he spent his entire adult life not existing, invisible to every single piece of technology that was ever built to catch him. This is the story of how science finally caught a dead man. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you're the kind of person who believes that no victim should ever be forgotten, that the passage of time should never be an excuse to stop looking, hit that subscribe button right now. Not for me, for Mary. Every subscriber, every share, tells the algorithm that these stories matter, that the people who lived them deserve to be remembered, not buried under decades of silence. If this channel is going to keep giving cold cases the attention they deserve, it's because people like you decide these stories are worth carrying forward. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's walk through exactly how a case this cold finally thawed. To understand how devastating Mary London's murder was, you first have to understand how deliberately, how carefully her entire life had been built around safety. Mary lived with her family in Sacramento, California. By January of 1981, she was a sophomore at Sacramento High School, a place she'd walked through the doors of hundreds of times without incident. She had been diagnosed as developmentally disabled, a condition that shaped how she processed the world and how she moved through it. And because of that, her family didn't leave her days to chance. There was no wandering after the last bell rang. No spontaneous stop at a friend's house. No unplanned detour through downtown on a whim. Mary's life ran on a schedule that her family had constructed with intention, a prearranged pickup system designed for exactly one purpose: to make sure she was never left alone, never left exposed, never left unsupervised in a world that can be cruel to people who don't move through it the way everyone else does. This wasn't overprotection. This was love expressed as structure, and it worked day after day for years. Her sister, Esther Schneider, would later describe her in the simplest, most heartbreaking terms: an innocent, gentle teenager. Someone who followed her routine without exception. Someone the family trusted precisely because she was so consistent, so reliable, so unlikely to ever put herself somewhere she shouldn't be. On Wednesday, January 14, 1981, that routine played out exactly the way it always had. Mary went to her classes. She moved through the halls of Sacramento High School like any other day. She was seen on campus at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, a completely unremarkable sighting, the kind that would mean nothing at all if the day had ended the way every other day had ended. But it didn't. For reasons nobody would understand for almost 40 years, Mary never made it to her pickup point. She simply wasn't there. And for a family that had built an entire system around the certainty of her routine, that absence didn't feel like a delay. It felt like an alarm going off. They didn't wait to see if she'd show up late. They didn't spend the evening making phone calls to friends, hoping for a simple explanation. They understood their daughter. They understood that if Mary wasn't where she was supposed to be, something had happened to her. Not because she'd made a choice, but because the world had made one for her. That same evening, the family walked into a Sacramento police station and filed a missing person report. What none of them could have known, sitting in that station on the night of January 14th, was that the search for Mary London was no longer a search for a missing teenager. It had already become something far worse. And the terrible answer was sitting less than 24 hours away, on a stretch of road that almost nobody in Sacramento even knew existed. That night must have been unbearable. Not knowing is its own kind of violence. The mind runs through every possibility, the good ones and the unthinkable ones, and there's no way to make it stop. The family waited through the dark hours of January 14th into the early morning of January 15th, holding on to whatever hope they could, while 40 miles of Sacramento slept around them, unaware that the answer was already out there in the cold. The next morning it was found. A passerby driving along San Juan Road, an unpaved, rural corridor near the airport, west of Interstate 5, spotted something that shouldn't have been there. The area was sparsely populated, mostly agricultural land, mostly used by farm workers and people accessing nearby waterways. It was the kind of place people drove past, not through. Isolated, quiet, the kind of place where something could be left behind and stay hidden for a long time. Lying on the shoulder of that road was the body of a 17-year-old girl. Officers from the Sacramento Police Department responded to the scene and began the grim, methodical work of processing it. What they found told them almost everything and almost nothing at the same time. The Sacramento County Coroner's autopsy would later confirm that Mary had been stabbed multiple times. She had been left mostly nude at the site. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The cause was acute hemorrhage from multiple stab wounds inflicted with a sharp cutting instrument. But one detail at the scene told investigators something crucial before they even had a name to attach to it. The soil around her body showed only minimal blood pooling, a sign to anyone trained to read a crime scene that this was not where the attack had actually happened. This was a dump site, somewhere else, in some other location that investigators would never be able to identify. A violent assault had taken place. And afterward, Mary's body had been transported here, to a stretch of road chosen specifically because it was remote enough that a body could sit undiscovered, at least for a while. No weapon was ever recovered. The state in which she was found pointed toward the possibility of a sexual motive connected to her abduction, though the specifics would remain undetermined and unreleased for decades to come. What investigators did manage to do, almost out of pure procedure rather than any real hope of future use, was preserve biological evidence. Swabs collected from Mary's body during the autopsy. Her remaining clothing. Evidence handled the only way anyone knew how to handle it in 1981. Cataloged, sealed, stored, and filed away in the quiet hope that someday, somehow, it might matter. Nobody in that room could have imagined what those swabs would one day become capable of revealing. In January 1981, they were just evidence. Routine. Ordinary. A box on a shelf. Nobody could have predicted that nearly 40 years later, that same evidence would be the single thing that finally broke this case wide open. But that was decades away. In the immediate aftermath, all detectives had was a scene that told them almost nothing they could use. A dump site instead of a true crime scene, no weapon, no witnesses, and a 17-year-old girl who could not have walked to that remote stretch of road on her own. Someone had taken her there. And somewhere in Sacramento, someone knew exactly who that was. I need to pause here for a second, because this is the point in the story where most true crime content moves on to the investigation like it's just a procedural checklist. But I don't want to move past this too quickly. Somewhere right now, there is a family living through exactly what Mary's family lived through that night. The not knowing, the waiting by the phone, the refusal to accept that their loved one just wandered off. If this story is making you feel something, I want you to do one small thing. Drop a comment with just her name, Mary London, so that when people scroll through this video, they see that she was remembered by name, not just referred to as the victim. Costs you 10 seconds. It means something. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because we're about to walk through why this case sat frozen for almost 4 decades. And it's not because nobody was trying. To understand why Mary London's case went cold for 39 years, you have to understand what police work actually looked like in Sacramento at the dawn of the 1980s. This wasn't incompetence. This was the ceiling of what science could do at the time. Forensic analysis in 1981 relied almost entirely on a method called phosphoglucomutase typing, a way of sorting biological evidence into broad blood groups. It could tell you that a sample belonged to a general category of people. It could never tell you that it belonged to one specific person. Fingerprint work was still done by hand, matched against paper card indexes in filing cabinets. Hair and fiber comparisons were largely visual judgment calls, useful for building suspicion, nearly useless for proving anything in court. And information didn't move between police departments through databases or instant searches. It moved through landline phone calls, teletype machines, and stacks of paperwork mailed or driven between offices. At the same time, Sacramento itself was a city in the middle of a transformation. The area around North Sacramento and the Natomas Basin, where Mary's body was found, sat exactly at the collision point between fast-growing suburban development and quiet, secluded agricultural land. San Juan Road was the kind of place that had fallen through the cracks of that growth. Unpaved, rural, forgotten by most of the public even as new neighborhoods rose up around it. It was, in the cruelest possible sense, the perfect place to leave a body. And that same isolation that made it perfect for concealment also made it a nightmare for investigators trying to reconstruct what had happened there. Detectives from the Sacramento Police Department's Homicide Division didn't sit on their hands. They mapped out Mary's likely route home from Sacramento High School after she was last seen around 3:30 that afternoon. They canvassed the school. They interviewed faculty and students. They walked nearby transit corridors and conducted field interviews throughout the surrounding neighborhood, hoping someone, anyone, had seen something. And they hit a wall almost immediately because nobody had. There were no eyewitnesses to Mary's abduction. No one saw her get into a car. No one saw her walk off with another person. She simply left campus that afternoon and vanished from view, and by the time her family realized something was wrong, whatever narrow window existed for someone to notice and remember had already closed shut. Combine that silence with a crime scene that offered no weapon, no vehicle description, no physical trail to follow, and detectives were left holding biological evidence that the science of their era simply wasn't built to use. Blood typing could narrow a suspect pool down to a broad category of people, could not give you a name, and without a defined group of suspects to test that blood type against, the evidence just sat there, technically preserved, functionally useless. As the months rolled on, whatever leads existed dried up completely. There was no confession, no break in the case, no witness who suddenly found their conscience. And the case did what so many cases from that era eventually did. It went cold. Not forgotten. Not closed. Just cold. Waiting for a kind of science that hadn't been invented yet. For years, that's exactly where it stayed. A file that got pulled out, reviewed, and set back down again and again with nothing new to show for it. Then, slowly, the world of forensic science began to change around it. Between 1981 and the mid-1990s, the Mary London case file didn't disappear from the Sacramento Police Department's records. It stayed alive the way unsolved homicide cases often do, periodically revisited by cold case detectives, checked against new leads that never quite panned out, kept in that strange limbo between active and abandoned. The real turning point began in the late 1990s and early 2000s, with the rise of a method called short tandem repeat DNA testing, known in forensic circles simply as STR typing. Unlike the blood grouping methods of 1981, STR testing could identify genetic markers specific to an individual, not a broad category, an actual person. Detectives had the original autopsy swabs pulled and re-examined, and for the first time, nearly 2 decades after Mary's murder, a male STR DNA profile was successfully generated from the evidence. Felt, for a moment, like the case might finally break open. That profile was submitted to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database that compares crime scene DNA against the genetic profiles of convicted offenders. It was the best tool available. It was the tool that had cracked open thousands of cold cases across the country. Came back with nothing. 0 hits. The reason was almost cruelly simple. CODIS can only identify someone if their profile already exists inside the system. typically because they were convicted of a qualifying felony sometime after the database was established. Whoever had killed Mary London had never been entered into that system. He existed completely outside the reach of the exact technology that was supposed to find him. But the department didn't let the case fade into total silence. On January 15, 2016, the 35th anniversary of Mary's murder, Sacramento Police Chief Samuel D. Summers Jr. authorized a renewed public appeal. The department was searching for one specific individual, a black male adult they knew only by the name Daryl, believed at the time to be roughly 57 or 58 years old. Detectives were careful to make one thing clear: Daryl wasn't a suspect. He was believed to be a friend of Mary's, someone who might be able to fill in gaps about her life and her social circle in the days before she disappeared. It was a long shot, a name from 35 years earlier, hoping that someone in the community still remembered him, still remembered anything. But the real turning point for this case, and honestly for cold case investigation across the entire country, was still 2 years away. And it wouldn't come from Sacramento at all. It would come from a case that had haunted California for over 40 years, and from a piece of technology that was about to change everything about how the past gets uncovered. If you've made it this far, you already understand something important about this case. That cold never meant forgotten. For 35 years, detectives kept pulling this file back out, kept checking it against new science, kept refusing to let a teenage girl become a statistic. That kind of persistence deserves recognition. So here's what I'd ask of you, like this video. Not for me, for the detectives who spent decades on a case with almost nothing to work with, who kept believing that science would eventually catch up. Every like tells YouTube this story deserves to be shown to more people, and that's really the only kind of justice left to give a case like this, making sure it's never buried in silence again. Now let's get to the breakthrough that finally cracked this case open. In 2018, an entirely different investigation would change the trajectory of cold cases across the entire country. That year, the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo in the Golden State Killer investigation sent shockwaves through law enforcement nationwide. A case that had terrorized California for decades, one that had outlasted multiple generations of detectives, just like Mary's, had finally been solved, not through a traditional criminal database, through something completely new. Following that arrest, Sacramento County District Attorney and Marie Schubert and the Sacramento Police Department aggressively expanded their use of a technique called investigative genetic genealogy, often shortened to IGG. And what makes IGG so different, so much more powerful than anything that came before it, is what it doesn't need. CODIS can only find a match if the actual suspect's own DNA is already sitting inside a criminal database. IGG doesn't need that at all. It only needs one distant relative somewhere, anywhere in the suspect's extended family tree, to have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to a public genealogy database, for any reason at all. A hobbyist tracing their ancestry. Someone curious about where their family came from. Someone who had no idea, and never would know, that their decision to spit into a tube would one day help solve a murder they'd never even heard of. Mary London's case became one of the files selected for this new approach. The biological evidence collected during her 1981 autopsy, evidence that had already survived nearly 4 decades of storage, through changing personnel, changing technology, and changing forensic standards, was submitted for a process called single nucleotide polymorphism microarray testing, commonly shortened to SNP sequencing. Where the older STR method only examined a small handful of genetic markers, SNP testing generates an extraordinarily dense genomic profile, detailed enough to be compared directly against the kind of consumer ancestry databases that millions of ordinary people use to research their own family history. That profile was uploaded into the database maintained by GeneMatch and processed in partnership with the genetic genealogy laboratory known as Gene by Gene, parent company of Family Tree DNA. From there, forensic genealogists began a process that looks almost nothing like traditional detective work and almost everything like painstaking historical research. They weren't looking for a direct match to the killer. They were looking for fragments, small shared segments of DNA connecting the crime scene profile to people scattered somewhere across an unknown family tree. People who had never committed a crime in their lives. People who had no idea they were about to become, unknowingly, the thread that led investigators to a killer. Using public birth indexes, old census records, land ownership documents, and death certificates, the genealogists began reconstructing an entire family lineage branch by branch, generation by generation, narrowing an enormous, sprawling web of possible relatives down first to a single family and finally down to a single name. For the first time in 39 years, investigators weren't staring at an unmatched blood type sitting silently in storage. They were looking at a name. But identifying a name through a family tree is only the beginning of confirmation, not the end of it. Investigators still had to determine exactly who this person was, what had happened to him, and whether he was even still alive to answer for what he'd done. The name that emerged from that investigation was Vernon Parker. And what investigators learned about him complicated the case in a way absolutely nobody expected. Vernon Parker had been a teenager himself in January of 1981. Meaning that both the victim and the person responsible for her death were teenagers at the time of the crime. He lived in Sacramento, in the same general area as Mary, though investigators found no documented prior relationship between them before the murder took place. Two teenagers, living in the same city, whose lives intersected for one violent afternoon in a way that no records, no yearbooks, no friend group would ever explain. And then came the detail that explained, in a single stroke, why every DNA database in the country had failed to find him for nearly 40 years. Vernon Parker was killed in an unrelated homicide in Sacramento in 1982, roughly 1 year after he murdered Mary London. Parker died before CODIS existed. He died before STR-DNA testing existed. He died decades before anyone had ever built a consumer genetic genealogy database. His DNA was never entered into any criminal justice system anywhere, not because the system had somehow failed to catch him, but because he never lived long enough to be caught by any conventional method at all. Sacramento Police Chief Daniel Hahn and District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert stood together at a press conference on April 22, 2020, and formally announced that Vernon Parker had been identified as the person responsible for the 39-year-old murder of Mary London. For the department, it was the end of a search that had outlived multiple generations of detectives. Officers who had worked this case retired and passed it along to the next generation who did the same. For Mary's family, it was the end of not knowing. But identifying Parker raised a question that had nothing to do with forensic science and everything to do with the justice system itself. If the man responsible for Mary's death had already been gone for nearly 4 decades, what did solving the case actually mean? Under California law, there is no statute of limitations for prosecuting murder. The 39-year gap between Mary's death and Parker's identification presented no legal barrier to filing charges. But the law runs into a much older, much simpler principle the moment a suspect is already dead. Under long-standing legal doctrine, criminal jurisdiction ends the moment the accused dies, a concept known as abatement by death. There was no defendant left to charge. No trial that could ever take place. No courtroom where the facts of this case could be formally tested and confirmed in front of a judge or a jury. Instead, the Sacramento Police Department classified the case using a specific designation that exists precisely for situations like this one. Exceptionally cleared, offender deceased. It's a classification reserved for cases where investigators have established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt through physical and forensic evidence, but where circumstances outside their control, like the death of the person responsible, make a formal arrest and prosecution permanently impossible. At the press conference, District Attorney Schubert spoke about the broader significance of the technology that had made this identification possible, describing investigative genetic genealogy as a tool that had fundamentally changed law enforcement's ability to solve violent crime, both to identify the guilty and, just as importantly, to clear the innocent. She pointed to Mary London's case as one more example of what happens when persistence in law enforcement meets genuinely innovative science. And she spoke about who Mary had actually been. Not a case file, not a set of initials, but a vulnerable young teenager who had simply disappeared from school one ordinary afternoon. A description that, in its plainness, captured exactly how senseless this entire 39-year mystery had really been. Chief Hahn's remarks focused on something slightly different. The idea that time itself offers no real protection to anyone who commits a violent crime. He stated plainly that a person cannot escape justice and cannot outrun the horrific things they've done to someone in their own community. It was a pointed statement, especially given that the person it was directed at had already been dead for almost 40 years. But by that point, the message wasn't really about Vernon Parker anymore. It was about the department itself. Proof that even a case frozen for 39 years is never truly closed as long as the evidence still exists to examine, and as long as someone is still willing to look at it. There would be no trial for Vernon Parker. No verdict. No sentencing. No moment of formal accountability inside a courtroom. But there would be, for the first time in almost 40 years, a name. And for one person more than anyone else, that name meant everything, even without a trial attached to it. Mary's sister, Esther Schneider, became the family's primary voice in the aftermath of the announcement. Speaking publicly about what the identification meant to them, her reaction wasn't anger. It wasn't focused on the fact that there would never be a courtroom, never be a sentence read aloud, never be the kind of ending most people picture when they imagine justice. It was gratitude. She thanked God for the outcome, and she specifically thanked the people who had spent decades working this case, acknowledging just how hard investigators had fought to finally learn who had done this to her sister. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. Schneider's family had spent 39 years without a name attached to their grief. There had been no closure, no resolution, no answer to the most basic question a family in their position could ask. Who did this to her, and why did they choose Mary? The fact that Vernon Parker had died in 1982, just a year after the murder, meant a courtroom conviction was never going to happen. There would be no moment where the family could watch a judge deliver a sentence. No moment of legal finality in the traditional sense that most true crime stories end on. But what they got instead was something that mattered just as much, if not more. They got proof that Mary had never been forgotten. They got confirmation that for 39 years, somewhere inside the Sacramento Police Department, detectives kept looking, kept reviewing the file, kept preserving evidence with the kind of care that assumes science will eventually catch up, even if it takes decades to get there. When it finally did catch up, the answer didn't arrive through a confession or a witness. It arrived through the quiet, patient science of genetic genealogy, built entirely on evidence a crime scene technician in 1981 had no possible way of knowing would ever matter this much. For a family that had lived without answers for almost 40 years, that was enough to bring, in Schneider's own words, real thanks, not for a verdict, but for the truth itself. And the resolution of this case didn't just matter to Mary's family. It mattered to the entire field of cold case investigation because of what it proved was possible. Up until this point, investigative genetic genealogy had mostly been associated with catching serial offenders, most famously, the Golden State Killer case that had inspired Sacramento's own expanded use of the technique in the first place. Mary London's case demonstrated something different, and in some ways even more important, that this same technology is just as capable of solving isolated, single-victim cold cases involving vulnerable people. Cases that might otherwise never receive the same sustained attention as a high-profile serial crime, simply because there was only ever one victim, one family, one name. It also established something close to a blueprint for how cold cases could be approached going forward. The partnership between the Sacramento Police Department, the District Attorney's Office, and the private genetic genealogy laboratory that processed the evidence showed departments across the entire country what a coordinated, modern approach to decades-old evidence could actually accomplish. And perhaps most quietly important of all, this case underscored exactly how critical long-term evidence preservation truly is. Those biological swabs, collected during Mary's autopsy on a January morning in 1981, had to survive 39 years of storage, through changing technology, changing personnel, and changing forensic standards, before they could finally be tested using a method that didn't exist for almost the entire time they sat waiting. Without the discipline of proper chain of custody and careful, climate-controlled storage maintained across 4 decades, none of this would have ever been possible at all. The murder of 17-year-old Mary London stands, in the end, as one of the clearest demonstrations of how far forensic science has traveled. Proof that a case which seemed permanently, hopelessly unsolvable in 1981 could still be resolved with total scientific certainty nearly 40 years later. Vernon Parker was never arrested, never tried, never sentenced, but he was identified conclusively, scientifically, beyond any reasonable doubt. And that identification proved something Sacramento investigators seemed to have believed all along, through every year this case sat cold. That a case is never truly abandoned, as long as someone is still willing to look. Mary London didn't get a trial. She didn't get to watch someone answer for what happened to her that January afternoon. But she got something that, for 39 years, felt like it might never come. She got her name back, and she got the truth. If the story affected you the way it affected me while researching it, do one last thing before you go: subscribe and stay close, because we've got more cases like this one coming, cases where science finally did what silence couldn't. Thank you for sitting with Mary's story today. She deserved to be remembered. Now she finally is.